Hey, Slider Crusaders, welcome to our special Danger, or Democracy in Danger. Let's put aside what happened in this election, right? If it was rigged, if it was stolen, if you think there were unprecedented flooding of the nation with unsolicited mail-in ballots that made a difference in the outcome or not, it did. Put all that aside for the next hour. Put it aside. We can focus on that another day, and we will keep getting to the truth of that. Please don't get me wrong. But for this show, we are going to talk about moving forward. What should voting look like in America? The left in particular, they talk about how we're a democracy. Okay, great. But in order to have a democracy, you need to have a proper voting system. Not this. not whatever we've been doing. It's just been getting worse and worse. We use this analogy all the time when it comes to schools, our public schools. You would never, if you started from scratch, you would never build a public school system that looks like this. But it just evolves and devolves and gets worse and worse and worse. You put stuff on top of stuff, blah, 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 and pretty soon you got this entire mess. And I think that's what we have with our elections too. If you were to do this from scratch, it would never look like this. And Republicans are to blame for a lot of this. They've allowed a lot of this inept/corruptible system to go on. And there's just too many points of failure. It's too easy to commit fraud. It's too easy to just have mistakes be made. Now, obviously we're humans, right? You got to build that into it. That's part of it. We're humans, we're making flawed human systems. There's always going to be some level of fraud and some level of mistakes made. But this is totally out of control. Right? Remember out of Georgia when they were doing the recount? There were a couple days when they just found flash drives. You're like, what? You're like, oh yeah, we found a memory chip, got some votes on it. Like, oops, forgot? Forgot what? Where was it? How did you miss the memory chip? Where'd you find it? What other memory chips are there out there that we have not yet found or never will? Why are we putting all the votes on a single memory chip? Who thought this was ever a good idea? I love this line. This is Trump was right. I think this is his first speech after the election. He had this is one of the most sensible things he ever said. He said, it's a corrupt system, and it makes people corrupt, even if they aren't by their nature. They become corrupt. It's too easy. That was the same argument made in 1975 by the French politician who led the effort to get rid of mail-in voting in France. France had mail-in voting, I think it was 1958, maybe 1955, but 1950s and 1975, for about 20 years or so, they had mail-in voting, and they got rid of it. And the reason they got rid of it is because of the fraud that it creates. The line he said, the French politician said, it's an easy temptation. It creates an extra propensity and sometimes an indecent provocation for fraud. It's just tempting. It's too tempting. It's too simple. And we'll never stamp it all out, right? Criminals are always going to be one step ahead of everything. This is how it goes. But we don't need to be stupid about it, right? To make it so easy. And by the way, I should have said this from the jump. We have never on this show ever made a claim about voter fraud or about vulnerabilities in the system that the Democrats have not been making themselves for years, right? Never once have we made a claim on this show about voter fraud or potential voter fraud or hacking of system, anything. We've never made a claim that Democrats have not been making for years. You know, YouTube, they just came out and said they're not going to allow any more videos about election fraud. All right, no more videos about election fraud on YouTube, right? Which is wild. Should be extremely expected. You should not be surprised by this, but it's still wild. But PBS did a segment that's still on YouTube. PBS did a segment still on YouTube. They did the segment on 2018. And the segment is about how they interviewed some guy who said it is likely that Russia rigged the election tallies in 2016. Okay? So they're still pushing that in 2018. PBS was still pushing that. That's still live on YouTube right now, that whole segment about how it's likely that Russia rigged the vote tallies in 2016. Okay? Anyway. In France, you vote in person, day of, on paper. You put it in a literal, transparent box, right? At the end of the night, everyone stands there, counts the votes. In Canada, there's no electronic voting machines for national elections, and they have the same process up to then. Then they send their counts to two different places. They have a government source, and then they have a media source, all right? And they do that parallel with each other to check for any differences that may have occurred in the compilation of the data, which is going to happen when you compile large amounts of data. So let's do it twice so we can check it. Okay, this isn't rocket science. Okay, this is like and this needs to be priority number one for Republicans. Well, Democrats too, but for Republicans certainly moving forward. Every Republican-controlled state, and we're going to talk with someone out of Pennsylvania coming up at the end of the show. We're going to talk about Act 77, which is a disaster. But that's a Republican legislature there, right? Every Republican-controlled state needs to make this absolute first priority. Clean up your voting rolls, get all the dead people off it, get all the people who moved, right? That's like, get the illegal immigrants, like that's basic stuff. And then demand a voter ID and get back to low-tech paper ballots day of. Do not give an inch with this. As we saw in Wisconsin, right? The left will take every back door they can find. So Wisconsin requires voter ID. Even if you apply absentee, you have to upload an ID. But they put in a little loophole, right? If you're indefinitely confined, these are people who are so old and they're so sick they don't have an ID. Wisconsin did not want to disenfranchise these people. So if you're so sick and so old that you don't have an ID, you can apply for an indefinitely confined ballot, right? Makes sense. But Democrat officials publicly and actively told people that because of COVID, you could apply for an indefinitely confined ballot, which means you don't have to upload an ID and you don't need to provide a signature. The Wisconsin State Supreme Court said you can't do that unanimously, but the damage is already done. In 2016, there were 57,000 indefinitely confined ballots. In this election, there were 217, nearly a fourfold increase, right? So when it comes to voter integrity, Wisconsin, they let this little tiny loophole for a very small number of people, and the left just blew it wide open. In this hour, we're going to talk about what the perfect, ideal voting system looks like, so we know exactly what we need to be fighting for. That's coming up. Democracy in Danger. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Slater Crusaders, I want to get right to one of our favorite guests these last few weeks on this issue particularly. He is the expert, Hans von Spakovsky. He's at the Heritage Foundation. He's in charge of the Election Law Reform Initiative, which is what this is all about. Hans, how are you, sir?
I'm doing fine, thanks.
It's madness out there. And obviously, we're conservative, so I like federalism, and I like every state and even perhaps county coming up with their own thing, but that has created quite a hodgepodge, to say the least. How would you, perfect world, perfect, it is, Hans is dictator for the day and you can make the perfect election system. How would you make it?
First of all, you would need an ID, a photo ID to vote both in person and through an absentee ballot, which is the rule, by the way, in Canada, for example. You would have to provide proof that you are a U.S. citizen when you register to vote. All of the states in the country would, on a regular basis, compare their statewide voter registration lists with all of the other states to find people who have moved to ensure that no one is voting more than once because they're registered in more than one state. All of the states would be using their databases, their statewide databases, and comparing them also to other state databases to make sure the information is accurate. And just give you a quick example of what I mean. Look, county election officials don't do something very simple. When somebody registers to vote, they don't check the registration address against their county tax records. Why is that important? Because you have to register where you live. You know, you can't register at a McDonald's or a UPS store. And if you are, that's an indication that you may be engaging in fraud, right? Well, what do county tax records have? They know every property in the county, right? They know whether it's commercial or residential because they want to collect their taxes. Well, if they checked that, then they would be able to ensure that that kind of thing isn't happening. It's all kinds of very simple stuff like that that could fix the problems that we have in our current system.
Okay, I got some more examples, but let me, or some potentials, but let me stop here on that one. Why don't they? Let's just do the voter rolls. All right, like, are they inept? Is it a technically difficult problem? What's going on? Why are we not purging our voter rolls? Or purging is a strong word, a weird word, like a pejorative word, like checking them.
Well, some of it is ineptness, some of it is lack of funding, and some of it is just they're used to doing things an old way and they just don't take into account new technology and how they could use it. I mean, to give you another quick example, right? Why don't they check Google Earth every time they get a registration form from somebody to check the picture and see where the place the person is registered, is it actually a house or is it a vacant lot? You know, that would tell them very quickly whether it's potentially a fraudulent registration.
Wow. So what would it take to do that? Is it a county, state, federal thing?
I think state officials have the primary responsibility for administering elections. That means state legislatures need to get deeply involved in this and basically amend the laws to require these kinds of things. I mean, look, just a very simple one. Force election officials in every state to check their voter registration records against DMV records. You know, that would not only show where people have lived and when they're moving, but it would also, for example, show if someone who is a non-citizen but here legally, if they've gone and gotten a driver's license, well, that information would help election officials know, well, they're not a U.S. citizen. They shouldn't be allowed to register to vote.
So it's crazy because all the information's out there, as you're talking about. You're just talking about checking it all. It's not...
Right.
So what's up with these state legislators, these red states, right? So Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, that have all these fraud and have all these like ridiculous systems and aren't doing it right. What's the holdup here? Let's just look at Pennsylvania, right? So Act 77, which did a bunch of things, and one of them was created the no excuse needed absentee ballot. That was back in October of 2019. Why would the Republicans in Pennsylvania vote for that?
I think they were just not, frankly, I think they were ignorant. They didn't understand what they were doing. You know, it sounds great. It sounds like, oh, this is wonderful. It's going to make voting easier. But they don't understand that while you want to make sure that everybody who's eligible is able to vote, you don't want to introduce vulnerabilities into the system that folks can take advantage of. And I think they may have learned from this election that, yes, while we do need absentee ballots for people who really can't make it to the poll because they're sick or disabled or they're overseas military folks, you don't want to encourage everyone else to vote through absentee ballot because it's just too vulnerable to exploitation and all kinds of other problems.
Monday's show, we talked all about the Thomas Sowell line, that there are no solutions, only trade-offs. And this is a good example.
Yes.
Progressives think, we'll just balance out to everyone and there's your solution. It's like, well, no, there's trade-offs. I love that. Introducing vulnerabilities. Right. What do you think about day of voting? So my understanding is in France, so in Pennsylvania, they only have day of voting, right? France, they got rid of mail-in ballots. And in Canada, do they only have day-in voting too? My question is, what do you think we should have? Only day of or anything before or what?
I think early voting should be very much restricted to only a very short amount of time before the election. And I'll give you another good example of why that is, particularly during primary elections. Look, if you vote 6 weeks or 2 months before Election Day, during primaries, by the time the election rolls around, the candidate you voted for may no longer be in the race. And that, in fact, happened this year. The Super Tuesday primary, remember, we had that in March before COVID-19 shut down the problem. 1 and 2 days before Election Day, two of the big Democratic candidates, Klobuchar and Pete Buttigieg, dropped out. But if you look at the vote totals from the dozen or more states that were in the Super Tuesday primary, you found hundreds of thousands of people had voted early, and they wasted their vote because they voted for candidates who were no longer in the race on Election Day. And that's one of the big problems with early voting.
Is there an increase in fraud potential for early voting or not so much?
Well, it depends. If you require an ID when people come in to vote, that's going to cut down on that kind of fraud. But if you don't require an ID, it just makes fraud easier to commit. Canada, by the way, does have, as you know, absentee balloting, but they have an ID requirement, both for in-person voting and for absentee balloting.
Okay. Except for, Wisconsin does too, except for their, indefinitely confined ballots, right?
Yes.
Which
right,
they normally have like 5 to 10,000. Now they have 250,000 this year.
Right. That was a huge security hole that they drove a semi-tractor trailer truck through in order to avoid the ID requirement.
Amazing. Okay. What do you think about paper ballots versus electronic? And we don't have to go into whole Dominion conspiracy theories. I don't expect you to bring up Hugo Chavez here, but any sane person / the left for years has been complaining about digital ballots. Would you get rid of them?
Well, what I would say is that if you're going to have electronic voting machines, you want an electronic voting machine that when you have finished your session prints out a paper ballot so that you can see how it has recorded your ballots, and also so that if there's a question after the election, if there are claims that somehow the software miscounted ballots, you've got the paper ballots there that you can hand recount, and you've got an audit trail.
My understanding with that is there was this story we saw a couple years back of the Princeton University professor who looked at these electronic voting machines. I think it was in Georgia. I forget where it was. And he talked about how it's something like only 30% of people check their paper ballot to see if it's the same as what they typed into the screen or not. So it's not as much as a security protection as we would think. What do you think of that?
Well, that may very well be true, but the key thing to voting is having an audit trail. With paper ballots, you've got an audit trail because you can recount the paper ballots. With electronic voting machines, you want one that produces and prints out a paper ballot so that if there are questions afterwards, you can go back and you can recount them manually and make sure that those numbers agree with what the electronic totals are telling you.
I want to talk about the counting of ballots.
Yes.
Now, there's a lot of ballots here, right? There's a lot going on, so it's definitely going to be easier said than done here. But my understanding is in France, you put your envelope, you put your ballot in a clear box, and then they count it right there. It never leaves the polling precinct. And anyone can watch as they count the ballots. How do we do it here?
Well, we're supposed to have poll watchers legally in those polling places. We've had problems, as you know, in this election of election officials breaking state laws in places like Michigan and Pennsylvania and kicking out legally qualified poll workers. All of those election officials ought to be terminated. They should lose their jobs to prevent that from happening. I think we need observers, not only in polling locations, but everywhere else where the ballots are being counted. And quite frankly, I think they ought to put cameras in the polling places and cameras in the counting locations so that everyone can watch it, just like you said happens in France. The only thing you would have to guard against is making sure that the cameras can't see how somebody actually votes when they fill out their ballot. But other than that, everything else should be above board and open and part of the transparency that the public can see.
One last question on this line of thought. Someone told me this the other day that in Canada, they count out the ballots in your precinct, and then they send that number to 2 different locations. They send it to like the government-run system and then a media-run system, and then they tabulate it out and make sure everything, correlates and everything is the same.
Right.
I feel like today, first of all, like we leave a county like an 80%, 90% blue precinct to just tabulate the votes themselves, which I think just seems problematic. And it goes the other way around too, right? Like a 90% red county. It seems weird that we just trust that county to do that the right way and accurately. But then they just send it off to one location. And it seems like there's a lot more potential for errors here if you don't have the ability to check. Is that accurate?
Yeah, look, I think that's actually a good idea what Canada is doing, to send it to 2 different locations so that each is verifying what the other is doing. And look, the secret to what you just talked about is state laws that mandate that in polling locations, no matter how they lean politically, you have representatives of both political parties in there as poll officials managing the poll. In other words, you have both sides watching each other like hawks to make sure that everything is being done above board. And that's a requirement that needs to be fulfilled in every state.
Just seems like huge hurdles here to leap over. Do you think, just with the craziness of this last election, there'll at least be the will in at least some red states to get some of this stuff done?
Yes, look, I've been warning and talking about this for years, but this year, finally, it seems to have reached the attention of legislators and the public. So I'm actually hoping, no matter what happens in the presidential election, that this will finally lead to states making needed changes like the ones we've just been talking about.
Yeah, and every conservative now, please call your state reps and demand that we have some real voter change. And they'll say, well, we don't know what to do. And you say, call Hans von Spakovsky. He will tell you exactly what we need to do.
I would be very happy to help them out with that.
Heritage Foundation, he's the head of the Election Law Reform Initiative. Hans, wonderful to talk to you as always, sir. Thank you.
Sure, thanks for having me.
Do it again. More coming up. Mike Slater, spread the word. Hey, Senate Crusaders, welcome back to our special Democracy in Danger. I want to talk about the electronic voting machines in this segment and how this is very unwise, I think. Let's see what Alexander FLEISS thinks. He's the CEO of Rebellion Research, big think tank. He's been a teacher at Cornell, Harvard, a bunch of other schools as well. Alexander, how are you, brother?
I'm doing great. Thanks so much for having me on today. Absolutely.
Yeah,
pleasure.
good to talk to you. So we've made the claim on the show that I don't make any claims of voter fraud, particularly with the voting machines, that Democrats and people on the left haven't been making for many years, and now all of a sudden are very silent about. But what is your general thought on these electronic voting machines? Should we have them or no?
Well, first of all, there's been voting fraud in probably every election in the history of the United States of America. So it's not a new thing. And in terms of whether it's in the margins, enough to push JFK over, for instance, Nixon in '60 versus this election. That's an individual question. Georgia was hand recounted and it seems to be okay, but you have to realize that it's a 2-hop system. So if there's software that creates 100,000 votes from 100,000 dead people, you would need someone on the ground to infiltrate this. It's not impossible, but the New York Times wrote about this and explained very simply that if you had someone on the inside who was willing to give 100,000 fake or dead people, which had been prearranged with the software company, it is potentially possible to be done. I think it's unlikely, but as we progress, I'm always impressed by how much harder people are working these days and the idea and the ingenuity. So I think until recently, we had a fair decent amount of faith in the voting systems. And in the 2000 election, we could see the physical situation. There was this Chad issue. Maybe it favored W, maybe it didn't, who knows? Either way, they did 3 recounts, W won, and maybe they screwed up on the voting machine itself, but that's just something people have accepted in elections. So I think Americans accept that there's a certain amount of fraud. Was it enough to be the difference this time around? I don't think so, no. I think...
Yeah, yes, and my argument has been that first there needs to be a desire, right? And I think people on the left think that, a lot of people on the left, enough people on the left think that Trump is literal Hitler. So would do anything to make sure he loses. And then I feel like these voting machines, the electronic voting machines, just make it potentially too easy to
absolute
commit
power corrupts,
said
absolutely. So
Yep.
people will commit the most heinous fraud possible to achieve their goals. That's just the way life is. I think, Machiavelli had a lot of great points that frankly hold true to this day. So you have to assume the worst can happen, even though whatever bubble you might be living in, that's confirmation bias in psychology. You assume what you know around you is the world itself, but that's not the way the world is. Going to Clausewitz, war is fought absolutely. So if people believe they're in a war, they believe that any tactics are potentially available. So, I personally think Trump lost. I think that he lost even with the fake voters. The number of fake voters I couldn't possibly estimate, but were there fake votes on the right as well? Probably. I couldn't imagine there wouldn't be. So do we need to overhaul the nation's voting system and create a blockchain based? Yeah, sure, totally. I love it. Everybody should have a vote based on their driver's license, and there should be some level, there's some semblance of kind of light shone upon our voting system. I understand privacy and whatnot, but if you want to make a vote in a presidential election, I think you need to be somewhat registered. So I say blockchain moving forward.
Let's talk about that. What is blockchain? Can you explain that to an idiot like me?
Sure. So all the cryptocurrencies, are super shady. And so they wanted to get people comfortable with them. And so they created this kind of open network, this open ledger, which is what blockchain is. There's nothing technologically advanced about blockchain. It's really just open ledger, very simply, two agents can do a transaction. And so with the blockchain, you can have it based on driver's licenses, and it's really impossible for fraud. So that's kind of
what makes it impossible. What about that makes it impossible for fraud?
Because it can be verified publicly, and it's open source. And so if you have an open source system, anyone can go on and see. And so anyone can see who anybody was. XYZ voted in Pennsylvania's XYZ district, and this is who that person is. But that's public disclosure of our nation's citizens, which I'm a libertarian, but I think that voting is a public act. And if you want to vote, you must. If you don't want to be in this public registry, then don't vote. Fine. But if you want to cast public ballot for our president, you should be on this public registry. And I'm a fierce libertarian. People compare me to Ron from that Parks and Recreation show.
Wow. Okay, that's very interesting. So why? So I understand that would make it verifiable, right? Like you could see that this person exists. But could that not also be hacked and votes changed, or no?
Well, you could create fake people. Sure. What can you do about that? As long you can. Could one create fake people and fake driver's licenses? Sure. You have to go the next step. See, with fraud, it's always the next step and the next step. And so you have blockchain. Oh, it can't be hacked. Well, you could just create 100,000 fake people with 100,000 real driver's licenses from Pennsylvania, but none of these people actually exist. Because if you're going to go, crime will always find a way. That's something else. You can never create anything that is, devoid of crime. That's just something we live with.
And I get that's totally true. But you're like a super smart guy on the cutting edge of all this stuff. How much do you trust our pathetic, know-nothing politicians to stay on the forefront of the security of our elections?
They won't. Politicians don't make any effort unless they're pushed by the people. So if there is a continued effort from, the body of America, something will happen. If this is, ADD America and we move on and it's the Macarena, nothing will happen. Politicians just want to be reelected. That's their job in life, is to get reelected. People forget that.
What's your motivation?
My motivation in life is to educate the world, and Rebellion focuses on technology, military. AI was our initial, and we have about 120 students, mostly graduate from Berkeley to Columbia Math to have a course at Cornell I'm doing right now. And so I love to, just educate the world. That's what I'm about. As an Amherst College alumnus, I believe in Terra Radiant, which is bringing light to the world. And so, Rebellion research is focused on really just education in any way whatsoever. But we're totally apolitical.
So
we do not touch politics ever.
Sure, but that's a true pure mission statement, as opposed to, you're right, the politician's mission statement, which is just to get elected.
Well, my grandmother's a co-founder of Head Start, so it's kind of in my blood.
Yeah, awesome. So you referenced this article from 2018, this New York Times article, The Myth of the Hacker-Proof Voting Machine. And this is 2008, this is New York Times. And like I said before, I've never made an argument again about voter fraud that the left hasn't made for years. So here they are in 2018 talking about this. And their argument was that you can, in some of these machines, you can hack into them remotely. Like they have like remote access software on them. Like that's
anything
like
is hackable.
Basic stuff.
Anything is hackable.
Good.
Okay. I mean, I'm friendly with the hacker who took over the United Airlines flight 5 years ago. I'm sure you read about that. There was a United Airlines flight that was moved around a bit by my buddy who, I mean, he doesn't acknowledge it, but it was, if you read the article in the Washington Post, he was sitting in like 31D and he decided to, bank the plane a few times to show that he could. But as he did it though, he shared it with the NSA and the FAA, so he wasn't trying to harm anyone. He was just showing how hackable our nation's airplane infrastructure was.
What? So you're right. If that's hackable,
everything is hackable. Everything. There is nothing that isn't hackable.
I'm thinking of what happened with Twitter a couple months ago, where like all the top Twitter accounts got hacked, and like they were like, "Hey, send us Bitcoin," and it was a 17-year-old in Florida.
Yeah. No, I mean, you can. There's nothing from a Bitcoin wallet to Donald Trump's email. Everything is hackable.
Wow. So why are we supposed to believe that an election wouldn't be? I just feel like because of all this, I feel like you got to go as low tech as possible. So I'm reminded of.
I like that. I agree with you. That's how I deal with bugs. You have multiple systems and separate domains. That's the lowest tech possible. Just in case one gets corrupted, you can see because you're running them simultaneously. So the lowest tech, you are completely right, is the best way to keep fraud out.
So let me share this quick story, and then I want to go back to the words you said, because I don't know what those words exactly were, other than "you're right," which I always like to hear. It was the federal government, like the military, they have their nuclear secrets, or like the nuclear codes or whatever, are on a floppy disk. And when I first read that, I was, your classic, oh, government's still backwards, like the DMV, blah, blah, they can't do anything right. But then I learned is like, no, we do this on purpose because you can't hack into a floppy disk. There's a reason we still have it on a floppy disk. So
I've got a terrible story for you then. If you're worried about our nation's missiles, I've got a friend who worked on missile defense, and the Chinese are hacking us so badly to the point that the actual missiles, physically located in the Marshall Islands, and there's 12,000 local Marshallese on these islands. At the same time, you have this Navy missile base. But then all of a sudden, you have like 6 to 12 young 35-year-old Chinese people, endlessly funded, taking pictures, who buy these front stores from the locals, and they're taking all their pictures. At the same time, all the workers at the Navy station have to have their Blackberries changed every, I think it's 12 minutes now, with an 18-digit code that's constantly changing. And all the times their computers are changing to weird Chinese porn and weird Chinese stuff comes through their machines. It's unbelievable. It's something like every 3 to 6 months. So there's a constant war. We know they're trying to do it. They want to. It's happening right now.
Wow, and no one knows about that except for people like you who are in that world. Unbelievable, and that's what.
Accepted. It's just what life is. The Chinese are trying to spy in every possible aspect, but we're trying to spy in them as well, though.
Sure.
So
yeah.
So we are doing it.
So to bring it back to the election, I'm sure the Republicans are going to come up with their own election fraud game in 2024. But last point about, you talked about like bugs working simultaneously. What does that mean?
Well, if you have, if you're dealing with, you have to run the same system in multiple silos, independent of each other, to truly fight bug corruption. Otherwise, you have no way of knowing. And so it reminds me of contact, first rule of government spending. Why buy one when you can buy two for twice the price? The only way to really know a system works is to run two versions of the system.
So what would that look like? Like you wouldn't vote twice. What would that be?
I mean, I haven't conceived of it, but ideally your vote would go through two different systems. And so there would be two different systems taking the nation's votes. It's almost like, why trust one poll? We have 35 polls. Why trust one nation counting system? Maybe we should have 35 national counting systems, some of which, like Rebellion, are apolitical versus other counting systems that are, biased. And so really, if you want true safety, you need redundancy. And so your point about low tech was completely accurate. You have to go low tech to fight high tech with crime.
Okay. Alexander FLEISS, man, like bonkers to talk to you. but man, I appreciate it. CEO of Rebellion Research. Let's do it again, Alexander. Appreciate you.
Oh, my pleasure. Stay safe. Be well.
Thanks, man. Yeah, you too. More democracy in danger. More coming up. Spread the word. Hey, Slider Crusaders, welcome back to our special Democracy in Danger. So we've talked a bit on this show about Act 77, mostly because this was one of the potential Supreme Court cases. This is one of them that Ted Cruz was going to argue on behalf of, and the Supreme Court decided not to hear it just the other day. But alas, Act 77 is still very important as we figure out how we want to proceed. What should our elections look like moving forward? What can we learn from Pennsylvania's decision to pass Act 77? What is this thing? Vince Galco's here. He is the Senior Vice President of Mercury Public Affairs out of Pennsylvania. Vince, how are you, brother?
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Good to talk to you. So my understanding is this passed in October of 2019. So this is a pre-COVID thing, which is different than a lot of these other lawsuits are calling. So what is Act 77?
Sure. This was legislation that kind of flew under the radar. Most people weren't really paying attention to this, and giving the elected officials the benefit of the doubt. I think it was an effort to just increase participation in the democratic process. However, in hindsight, I think many would say that it went a little bit too far and didn't have enough oversight in place. The idea being was that Pennsylvania historically always had some of the toughest absentee ballot laws in the nation. You literally had to be out of town for business or medical, couldn't vote for medical reasons to qualify for an absentee ballot. And you could be challenged the day of at the polling place. If you happen to be in the precinct that day and you could have voted, the opponents could challenge your vote. At this time, the legislator decided to make that easier and said, we're going to have no excuse mail-in balloting. So they went ahead and passed no excuse mail-in balloting. In exchange for that, Republicans did away with the historically straight party ballot in Pennsylvania, which for a long time we had where you can go in the polling place and pull one lever for your party, or now fill in one oval for your party, and every candidate on that party would be your vote. So the trade-off was Republicans got rid of the straight party balloting and Democrats got no excuse mail-in balloting. But what the Democrats did is they turned that no excuse mail-in balloting into basically mail-in voting, and certainly changed the rules as we went along.
Wow, that's amazing. Okay. So I understand, I don't want to get off, I want to get back to all that, but there's a couple other things in Act 77 too, right? Like pays poll workers more money or something. Is any of that stuff significant, or is that just to the side?
I think, it goes to the think that the idea of, increasing participation in the voting process. Several things, such as ballots had to be received by the Friday before Election Day by 5 p.m. Act 77 allowed ballots now to be received up to 8 p.m. on Election Day. It increased the amount of time you can apply for a ballot. It increased the amount of time you could register to vote. All things with the idea of increasing participation in the process. The big issues where I think fraud and other things came into play, and I think where a lot of things just don't sit right with voters on both sides of the aisle, was what happened down the stretch. Certainly, the state legislature, Republican majority legislature, voted for Act 77 and for no excuse mail-in voting. What they didn't vote for, however, was unsupervised drop boxes throughout the Commonwealth, especially in large cities. They didn't vote for signatures not having to match on your registration and on your ballot, which is just absurd. And they didn't vote for extending the time period from Election Day till 3 days after the election when ballots would be taking place. So what it felt like, I think, was that the system was a little bit rigged down the stretch. Was it illegal? Probably not. But does it sit right with people? It shouldn't. And it shouldn't sit right with both sides, Republicans and Democrats, because who's to say in a few years you have a Republican governor and a Republican Supreme Court in Pennsylvania, and they do the same thing. So, Republicans aren't happy with what happened, but Democrats should also be concerned because the tables can turn on them just as quickly as the way this played out down the stretch.
Really good point. Let's go back to the trade-off here. So just to be clear, Republicans got the end of straight ticket voting. Do you know of any other state that still has that, where you can just vote for all the Democrats or all the Republicans?
I don't offhand, but I know it played a big part.
Go ahead, sorry.
No, I mean, it certainly played a part. And, you could say that, it did benefit the Republicans in Pennsylvania in the sense that we actually picked up 2 statewide row offices that ordinarily would have not gone Republican. Republicans won this year, and we were able to hold on to a lot of Republican seats in the legislature in the Philly suburbs, where historically, with a strong Democratic turnout, we would have lost those races. In fact, in the statewide row offices, 300,000 less people voted for the row offices than voted for president. And it seems like what happened was Republicans stayed in and voted for the entire ballot, where Democrats went in and voted for Joe Biden and left. So it actually helped Republicans down ticket, but certainly hurt President Trump.
Oh, interesting. Okay, all right, because I was trying to do the math of the trade-off here. I was trying to think if that was worth it, because at first glance, it seems like Republicans got totally hoodwinked on that move, because I was wondering how many people would even vote straight ticket like that. But you're suggesting that the Republicans did gain. There was a gain, no doubt about it.
There was it was a net certainly Republicans gained seats in the state House. We held serve in the state Senate. And we picked up our state treasurer and our state auditor general, which had been Democrat seats for a number of years now. So I don't believe that would have happened if the straight ticket would have been on the ballot, because Democrats would have gone in, or Biden supporters would have gone in and voted straight Democrat. This time they went in and voted for Biden and went home, where Republicans voted for the whole.
So maybe that's good short term, but is not now the direction that the state and all the blue states certainly moving is only mail in. Right, so maybe what you just described benefits in-person voting, but if we just keep pushing mail-in, 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 in California, they're moving towards mail-in only. That's been a push for a while now, especially in San Diego County. We had a special election in San Diego that was mail-in only. So then you wouldn't get that benefit as much as the one you're talking about, right?
That's correct. And I know that certainly Republicans in the legislature and across the state are vehemently opposed to mail-in only voting. I know New Jersey had it this year for the first time using COVID as an excuse. They only had mail-in voting, but there is no appetite for that in the legislature in Pennsylvania.
Appetite for what?
To go to straight mail-in voting only.
Got it. Okay, yeah. Well, is there any chance of reining Act 77 in and reining the mail-in ballots in moving forward?
I believe so. I mean, certainly there's been several lawsuits, as we all know, in recent days that have been shot down, both in federal courts as well as the Pennsylvania Supreme Court. The big thing now for the state legislature going back in 2021 is to increase oversight, more clarification, more verification of these ballots. You've heard a lot about the monitoring of ballots being counted, certainly in Philadelphia and other places where Republican watchers were not allowed to be within 20 feet of the ballots being counted, which is absurd. It's against the law. It was changed late in the process, but the early days of counting, they were not allowed to be there. And the other thing is, the Secretary of State and the Supreme Court allowed certain things such as signatures not having to match on ballots, as well as your registration, and these drop boxes, which just occurred all over the state, were unsupervised. People could just go in and drop. You didn't know who was voting for the ballots, and I believe that Governor and Secretary of State and the Supreme Court used COVID as an excuse to do this. They won't, fortunately, have that. Hopefully, not have that next year and going forward. So the legislature needs to put in more clarification, more verification of the process.
So I live in California, and we're Democrats across the board. I don't even know what it's like to live. And I used to live in Tennessee, which is Republicans across the board. So I don't know what it's like to live in a state like Pennsylvania, where you have a Democratic governor and then Republican state houses and Democrat this and a Republican that. How much power do the Republicans have to make these changes that are necessary?
Well, it comes down to having enough votes to override the veto, which they are close, but they're not there yet to override the veto. There are a few Democrats that did vote against Act 77, both I think almost 30 in the House and 2 in the Senate. So the question is, if the governor, who is now going to be a lame duck governor, does he have the strength to marshal those votes again? If a legislation comes that he chooses to veto, will it be overridden? But I know that the state legislature, the Republican leadership, is united on fixing this issue. The other big issue that plagued the state as well is that we have 67 counties, basically 67 fiefdoms. Some are very large. Some of our counties are as big as New England states, and some of our counties are very small. And every county has their own system of counting and processing, which certainly delayed the process. And I believe everybody worked with best intentions, but obviously when you have that many different systems and different timings, mistakes or perhaps even whether it be called fraud or anything else could come into play.
Yeah. We need every person listening now to demand the Republican leaders to make these big drastic changes that need to happen. I had another Pennsylvania question. So you mentioned the governor. I got a Supreme Court one too, but you mentioned the governor's a lame duck. You're going to have a Republican governor, you think, next, or another Democrat?
Well, Pennsylvania historically, if you look back, has gone two terms and switches party. That changed with Governor Wolf. He unseated Governor Corbett after just one term. That was the first time in Pennsylvania history. But historically, since the governor has gone to a 2-year term limited term as governor, it has flipped party every 8 years, other than the one anomaly with Governor Corbett. So in addition to the election problems, certainly the state has gone through massive shutdowns. Governor Wolf has been one of the most draconian in his methods of shutting down the state. And I know there's a lot of backlash, especially with small business owners and others, which I think also helped President Trump's vote total and coming so close to winning. There was definitely some appetite of distress with Governor Wolf's policies that helped the Republican Party as well. So I feel good about 2022. I think we're in great shape in the state, and I think we will have a great Republican governor in 2 years.
Last one about the Supreme Court. We were talking to Hans von Spakovsky, and he brought up the Pennsylvania Supreme Court and how far on the left it is. And his characterization briefly, I think it was Hans, said there are just 5 Democrat lawmakers who decided to run for Supreme Court and won. So it's a pretty politicized court. Is that accurate?
And they weren't all lawmakers, but they were. We have a few relatives of lawmakers, some sons of some Democratic officials that ran, and the Democrats basically dominate the court, and those members are from either Pittsburgh or Philadelphia. Most of the state is not represented. And so right now it's 5-2 in favor of the Democrats. We have an election this year. We actually have one of the Republicans on the ballot. So if we're able to hold that, it'll stay 5-2. But if we lose the Supreme Court this year, a vital election, we'll actually go 6-1 in Democrats' favor. Republicans kind of dropped the ball a few years ago. There were three seats available on the Supreme Court. And the Democrats and their allies, trial lawyers and unions and others, really rallied the troops, came together to plan and swept those 3 seats, which basically reshaped Pennsylvania politics going forward. So we have our uphill battle now to regain that court.
Yeah, very good. Vincent Galco, Senior Vice President, Mercury Public Affairs. Vince, appreciate your time.
Thanks for being here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks, brother. Good stuff. All right. Interesting, that trade-off, right?
Yeah.
The straight ticket voting versus the mail-in. All right. We need, again, every Republican to step up, every conservative, and as Vince said, every Democrat even, to step up and let's get back to a sane system, as low tech and sensible moving forward. Enough of this nonsense. Either way, Republican, Democrat, we can't be doing this anymore moving forward. True story. Mike Slater, spread the word.